Hello Rayclass, welcome to the Path of Exile build guide for my Fire Trigger Saboteur build. This is my second and potentially last build of the Settlers of Kalgor League. I'm loving the league a lot, but I don't really have any specific ideas for anything I want to do next, and realistically I've played this league a ton for the couple and a half weeks that it's been out. Way more than I've played the past several leagues, so I'm pretty satisfied with how things have been. So I might end up trying to sell off this build and maybe sell off the Gladiator as well, just so I have a bunch of Divines sitting in the stash in case I do have some idea for something later, but for right now this might just be the last build of the league. Super happy with the way this one turned out. It is based entirely around the new Trigger a Fire, Socketed Fire spell on Axe Enchant from the Settlers of Kalgor Enchanting Bench. As usual, you can find a path of building in the video description. It won't be mega detailed with notes and stuff. It'll basically just be the character in its current state with reasonable things checked in the configuration. Feel free to ask questions, comments below. I'll try to answer them as I can. As far as pros of the build go, it's got really fast clear. It's got pretty darn good single target. Not like uber boss deletion levels of single target, but good in general. It's got really good sustain. It's got really good survivability for general mapping. I easily just like speed leveled up to 97, and you could definitely go to 100 just grinding a map XP strat. You really shouldn't ever be dying just during general mapping scenarios. Cons, it has very specific and potentially hard to get / expensive gear requirements. Particularly the way I've done this setup, it's got some things that you really need to balance well, so it's not the kind of thing that you can just like go into and start from nothing. You definitely need some things beforehand. Though it has really good survivability for general mapping, it doesn't have like AFK levels of tankiness like my Gladiator build did. You definitely have to pay attention to what's going on, and you can't just like stand in mechanics on uber bosses. And it has pretty poor visual clarity. It's not like on the super high end of the scale of poor visual clarity, but it's not great. You're triggering approximately 24 really bright gold spells every second, so it's kind of hard to see what's going on sometimes. So with that, in the background here is just a clear of a strand map in my sort of super low investment Alva plus June plus Heist setup. And then I will stick in some tier 17 footage and a tier 17 boss after that, and then we'll go into the hideout and I will talk through what you need to know for the build.
Ready to revisit the park? Time to go. Hello. The influence of his greeting. Here you are, ready to revisit the park? Let's. Good job, Exile.
Alright, welcome to my hideout. I will talk you through everything that I can think of that you need to know for the build. As mentioned in the last guide, these aren't really intended to be super hand-holdy guides. Look through the POB if you want. I'm just going to do my best to explain it, and this isn't really aimed at new players. It's more of an inspiration. This is what I'm doing. Feel free to do something similar if you want. So, the very core of the build is the new enchant from Settlers of Kalgor that gives Trigger a socketed fire spell on hit with a 0.25 second cooldown. This can only go on axes, and you want an axe something like this, ideally. You want to get the Shaper and Elder combined, increased crit strikes and increased crit damage support. Then I did some suffixes can't be changed veiled orbing until I got the spell damage plus non-chaos is extra chaos, and then go ahead and craft +2 support gems and hits can't be evaded. This could be made a little better if you went for +1 socketed gems instead of the spell damage and non-chaos is extra chaos. And I was thinking of saving to do that, but it's potentially like 60 plus divines to do that. It's deterministic. You would just need to lock suffixes and do cannot roll attack mods, exalt, and if it doesn't hit you can exalt again and then try annulling after locking suffixes. Basically it's a 1 in 10 chance because the Shaper influence adds some other prefixes that are not attack rolls. On a regular non-influence stacks, if you did cannot roll attack mods and exalted a prefix, it would be guaranteed +1 gems, but Shaper adds 9,000 weight worth of other non-attack prefixes, and the +1 gems is 1,000 weight, so you got a 1 in 10 chance, and it's going to cost you 4 divs each time to relock and rewipe the affixes you don't want. So it could potentially get very expensive, and before I decided to save and sink money into that, I brought my character into POB and checked all the right boxes and stuff, and found out that in my particular setup, because I don't have a ton of % increased damage on the build in general, and because I'm full Fizz to Elemental conversion with a ton of Fizz added as Ellie as well, that 5% non-chaos is extra chaos is actually fairly significant, and it was only going to be like less than a 5% damage increase to switch that mod to a +1 socketed gems, and I didn't feel like sinking potentially 60 plus divines for 5% more damage on a build that already has pretty good damage. So you need that fire trigger. You're going to want the Squire in your offhand. This lets you get an effective 8 link if you're using 1 spell. Since we're using 2 spells, we're firing off 2 7 link spells. I'll go through the rest of the gear first before I talk about the spells and stuff. Helmet is basic, just life resistance, spell suppression. You're going to want some mana reservation efficiency there. The chest is a typical spell crit, frenzy charge on hit, additional curse chest here. You're going to want to get as much evasion and energy shield as you possibly can, because we are an EB mom setup, so we need a good energy shield pool in addition to our life pool. Rings are standard life resist. Try to go for evasion and energy shield as well. You again want as much energy shield as possible, and that evasion lets you pick up a 1-pointer mastery for 20% energy shield, which is solid. We are using Yoke of Suffering with Sovereignty anointed because we are picking up Charisma directly. Gloves. This is where it starts getting kind of specific. Basically, you want good life, spell suppress resistances, and then you need an implicit from Eater. You need to get to 25% conversion, and it can be either fire or lightning, and then you need to craft the other 25% to fire or lightning, and I'll get over why that is in a second. Belt and boots, you need cooldown recovery rate. You need to hit a total of 22% increased cooldown recovery rate between your belt and boots. That will get you down to another cooldown breakpoint in addition to the 30% cooldown that you get from Saboteur. And that'll get you, another little extra bit of casting per second. So, the reason why, we'll go into gems now, the reason why you want 25 fire convert and 25 lightning convert on your gloves is because one of the 2 spells we're using is Wave of Conviction. Wave of Conviction by default has 25% fizz to fire and 25% fizz to lightning built in. So if you get 25 more of each of those, it's now 50% fire, 50% lightning, and then we are adding approximately 50% of fizz as cold from our hatred with aura effect. So if I go into my character screen and hover Wave of Conviction, you can see that we are roughly evenly split between fire, cold, and lightning. Now what Wave of Conviction does is it applies a 15% exposure to whatever element it did the most damage with. And since we have all three approximately balanced, and then I am using, let's see if I can use the search function here to find where I have that jewel. Where's my balance of terror? Somewhere in here I've got a balance of terror. There it is. We're using a balance of terror with elemental weakness, which gives you up to 40% of fizz as a random element in the past 10 seconds, if you've cast LE weakness in the past 10 seconds. So since all three of our damage types are pretty close to balanced, whichever element this picks is going to be the highest element. And since we're casting Wave of Conviction approximately 12 times a second with a random element, that means it is definitely going to keep up all three types of exposure for minus 15% fire, cold, and lightning res all the time for us. And so that's why we want the 25 fire and 25 lightning conversion on the gloves, because it gives us that even balance of all three elements. The second spell we're using is Purifying Flame. It's just another nice fizz to fire conversion spell with a fire tag, so we can leverage all of our fizz added as and fizz conversion stuff. And it spreads consecrated ground everywhere and is really nice for clear, whereas Wave of Conviction is not very good for clear because your waves don't go very far when you're recasting them constantly, whereas Purifying Flame spreads consecrated ground all over the place, and then the shockwaves cover the entire consecrated ground, so you get really nice clear with that. We are using an Empower in here, obviously, because we have the +2 support gems craft on our axe, so make sure your Empower is actually in the axe with the 2 gems rather than being over in the squire. To round out the rest of those links, I'm using an LE Penetration. You kind of run out of good gems to use in terms of damage because you can't use LE Focus because we need our ailments. You obviously can't use Controlled Destruction. You don't need anything that affects cast speed. So you got to get a little creative with your gems here. So we got LE Penetration, and then I'm using Awakened Increased Area of Effect. You could obviously save some money here if you didn't want to get the Awakened version, but I had money left over, and this is probably going to be the last build of the league anyway, so I said, why not? Let's just get the Awakened Increased AoE. Obviously switch that out for Conk Effect for single target. And then we are using Vile Toxins at level 21 for our last support. So Vile Toxins is one of the strongest hit-based support gems in the game. You can see it does 5% more damage with hits for each poison on the enemy, and at level 21 that goes up to 9 poisons. So that's 45% more damage, which is really high for a support gem if you are keeping 9 poisons up on an enemy. And to ensure that we are doing that, I have used tattoos. I believe I used 5 of them. You could probably get away with 4 or even 3 realistically with the number of hits we're doing. But just tattoo some of your int nodes with chance to poison on hit. And then that's another area where this gain 5% non-chaos as extra chaos comes in. That makes it so that our spells can also poison in addition to our Lancing Steel from our axe. So we essentially instantly rack up that many poisons on the enemy so we get full effectiveness out of Vile Toxins. And that pulls double duty. We also want Chance to Poison because Yoke of Suffering gives enemies take increased damage for each type of ailment you have inflicted on them. Notice that's just each type of ailment, not elemental ailment. So you want to poison and also you want to bleed, and so I've also just used a tattoo on one strength node for 5% chance to cause bleeding. With as many hits as our Lancing Steel of Spraying is doing, we pretty quickly bleed enemies as well, so that gives us another application of the enemies take increased damage. And then of course we are shocking, igniting, chilling all the time, and sometimes freezing as well. So we get lots of ailments on enemies for lots of increased damage taken, and we get to fully leverage the large damage boost from Vile Toxins. So those are the spells we're triggering. How are we triggering those spells? We are using Lancing Steel of Spraying, the widely known, most overpowered triggering skill in the game, because it just fires a buttload of projectiles that will all aim at and hit one target, so you can trigger a lot of things really quickly. So I'm using Lancing Steel of Spraying with faster attacks. We don't get a lot of attack speed on the build, so this is really helpful for letting us not feel clunky and getting a lot of attacks out quickly. Then I'm using GMP, of course, just to add some more projectiles to that. I'm using returning projectiles. This will... it helps your clear because those projectiles will come back to you and then fly back out the back of you, so you kind of get omnidirectional clearing sort of action, and it doubles the amount of hits you're getting on a single target. With Pierce, which makes sure those projectiles will go through the single target the first time and then come back and hit them again. For a while, I was experimenting with Chain and Awakened Chain, and I do feel like Awakened Chain gives slightly better clear than Pierce. It'll give you more sort of omnidirectional clear because they will bounce around all over the place rather than being more one-directional like it is with Pierce. But you want the Pierce for single target so that you can double your number of hits with returning projectiles, and I just didn't feel like having another gem to swap for big single target, and I feel like the clear is fine with Pierce in all the time. But if you really want to improve the clear just a little bit more, you can use Chain instead. And then finally, life gain on hit. We're getting a really large number of hits with our Lancing Steel per second, and so life gain on hit is an excellent source of sustain. We are using a Frostblink with Culling Strike. You don't really need the Culling Strike, but I had one gem slot open and not really anything good else to use there, so I figured why not throw on a Culling Strike. Using Blood Rage just for the attack speed. We have Frenzy Charge generation from our test, but a little more attack speed is nice for shield charging and Lancing Stealing more quickly while you're mapping. Ellie Weakness of Curse, of course, so you can manually cast to trigger Balance of Terror for that extra fizz added as. For auras, we've got an Enlighten 3 linked with Hatred, Discipline, and Grace. Pretty standard kind of stuff there. And then, let's see, over here, by anointing Sovereignty and getting mana reservation efficiency on our hat, that lets us fit in another 25%er. You could go Herald of Purity if you just want some more damage, but I decided to go with Flesh and Stone. Level 21, it makes it so enemies in the AoE, you take 20% less damage from them. That's just a generic 20% less, so that's attacks, spells, damage over times, even anything that's in the AoE. And as you can see, we have an okay AoE on our Blood and Sand because Trickster gives you some, or Saboteur rather, gives you some generic AoE scaling. So we get a pretty good little buffer zone around us where enemies are dealing less damage. And then, of course, Saboteur also gives us the nearby enemies are blinded and blind enemies on hit and 15% reduced damage taken from blinded enemies. So between that 15% reduced damage taken and the 20% less damage taken on Flesh and Stone, and the fact that we have a pretty big pool with our life and EB Mom combined, it means we can actually survive quite a lot. And we have really big sustain, so as long as we can survive the one-shots, we're generally going to stay alive. I've then got Assassin's Mark as well for our additional curse that the chest gives us, and then I've got a faster attack shield charge so we can get around quickly. You can move around really quickly with shield charge plus Frostblink, just kind of alternating those and hitting some enemies with Frostblink, throw a Lancing Steel in between each one, and you can clear through maps really quickly. So, for passives. We are a Shadow, of course, and we are a Saboteur. Head out and grab some life, grab Charisma, of course, grab all the jewel sockets that we're next to. We want a good amount of energy shield to go with our life, so we pick up some evasion energy shield here. That gives us access to a mastery. We always have energy shield and 30% evasion for 1 point. Seemed pretty solid. Life and energy shield, and of course the spell suppression mastery for 15% suppression when we've got evasion everywhere. With my gear and that together, I was at 94%, so I needed 6% more, so I tattooed 3 suppression tattoos. Go ahead and sell this during a build guide video, of course. I mean, it's a bit unfortunate because those suppression tattoos are like 2 divs a piece when I bought them, at least. If you could get suppression on your body armor, of course, that would be great, and then you wouldn't need those tattoos, but I was pretty happy with the way this body armor turned out, despite the crappy 9-inch suffix, and I didn't feel like trying to craft a better one, and tattoos were a relatively easy way to solve it. Grab a Frenzy Charge, of course the Inveterate Wheel. If you're on the right side of the tree and you're not grabbing the Inveterate Wheel, you're probably doing it wrong. Crit multi against unique enemies on one crit mastery. Up here on the other crit mastery, we have 50% increased effect of non-damaging ailments so that we can get really good shocks and chills. Jewel Socket, Frenzy and Power Charge, Life. Since I didn't end up getting a life mod on my chest, I was able to grab this mastery for 15% increased life. Up here, importantly, we grab spell damage leeched as energy shield, and 10% of leech is instant. And along with our life gain on hit that we have on our attacks, our Watcher's Eye is base crit while affected by hatred, and energy shield on hit while affected by discipline. That applies to both attacks and spells. And then we have our spells leeching energy shield as well. So we get a ton of regular leech and then 10% instant leech. Energy shield costs are really, really high because, you know, we are spamming off 24 spells per second that cost around 120 mana. So in this case, 120 energy shield. So that's a really, really large energy shield expenditure. So the instant energy shield leech and energy shield gain on hit is really important for us. And then we are getting life leech from Doriani's Lesson on a cluster jewel up here. Of course, grabbing the influence wheel with our effect reservation mastery. Grabbing Ghost Dance, we have about 45k evasion when I have my frenzy charges up and flask popped, so this gives us a good amount of energy shield back when we get hit. And I have also grabbed the energy shield mastery for regenerate 2% of energy shield per second. Now you may be wondering, if we have such good sustain and we're getting all this energy shield on hit and instant energy shield leech, why do we want to use a couple points on these extra things like Ghost Dance and energy shield regen? The reason is because our energy shield is our survivability as well as our means of casting spells, and so if we take a huge hit, originally I was running into situations occasionally where I would take some massive hit and I would be completely out of energy shield, and so I would be unable to even do a Lancing Steel because, you know, it costs 50 energy shield here. And if you can't cast Lancing Steel, then you can't actually get any spells going, and you can't actually get your sustain going. So if you have Ghost Dance to pop you back up after you get hit with something like that, or just this little 2% energy shield regen, that'll quickly get you enough energy shield again to where you can actually use a Lancing Steel and get your sustain going. So I think it's worth a couple of points into those. Up here, Cluster Jewel setup, Sadist. As I mentioned earlier, we're pretty low on percent increased damage in this build, and Sadist is an excellent source of that for 1 point. One with Inspired Oppression here for, you know, a little bit of damage. We don't care about the mana stuff at all, but also increased effect of non-damaging ailments. And then Doriani's Lesson to get our life leech. The rest of our jewels, beyond the Balance of Terror and the Watcher's Eye, are all very similar. They are all life plus energy shield plus percent damage plus crit multi. Double crit multi might be better, but I'm not actually sure. That'd be super expensive to get as well, and as I mentioned, we're kind of low on increased damage, so I have a feeling that those just increased damages are pretty good. Over into the witch area here, we get another power charge, life. We'll grab the power charge mastery stuff here. It's a nice bit of extra damage and crit multi and crit chance. And then we head down toward Mind Over Matter, we get spell crit, and EB Mom together gives us a really excellent effective hit pool. That's about what the regular passive tree looks like. For the Saboteur, we're taking about what you would imagine. Trigger bots, since our spells are triggered from our axe. This gives us, 35% less damage, so you get 65% times 2, so it's 30% more damage. We are using Like Clockwork for 30% increased cooldown recovery rate. That gets you down 2 breakpoints relative to the base cooldown on 0.25 seconds. And then I think I mentioned the magic number you need to hit is 22% additional cooldown reduction between your belt and boots to get down 1 more breakpoint beyond that. Born in the Shadows, really nice tankiness. As I said, we got about 45k evasion, and then enemies are blinded on top of that, and you get some increased blind effect from that small node there. So enemies really don't hit us with attacks very often, and everything does less damage. And then finally, Explosives Expert. Nothing real amazing for an Ascendancy node, but just really strong generic stats with crit multi, crit chance, and Elipen. We are like 97% crit on our Purifying Flame, since it only has 5.5 base crit, and then we're crit capped on the Wave of Conviction. So we're essentially crit capped on both, with not a ton of investment into crit on the tree really, and that is mostly because we have so many sources of base crit. We've got the increased crit strikes gem built in from the axe, we got the base crit on the armor, we got the base crit on the Watcher's Eye, and we got the base crit on the Assassin's Mark. All that together lets us hit crit cap. As far as Pantheon stuff goes, Brine King, so you can't get chain stunned and can't get frozen. One nice thing is that we are spreading Consecrated Ground everywhere all the time, which is 50% reduced effective curses to you when you're on Consecrated Ground, and then I also use a reduced effective curses on you during Flask Effect Flask, so we are effectively immune to curses. Curses don't do anything to us. And then I grabbed Soul of Garakan here for the reduced effective shock on you. You could probably replace this block and stun recovery with more effective shock, and then you'd be effectively immune to shock as well. If I were to level this character one more time, which I just don't know that I really feel like doing at this point, I would probably put in the mastery here for the cannot be shocked while at maximum power charges. Pretty much always at maximum power charges, and then you could do something else with this mastery, but that's what I'm doing for now. Hopefully that pretty well covers everything you need to know about the build. For flasks, I've just got a life flask. I've of course got Jade and Stim Knight for a bunch of evasion, silver flask for onslaught, and then I'm using the Wise Oak on this character again because, again, I went out of my way to make sure that my uncapped res are all balanced at 86, 86, 86. So this is giving us penetration and damage reduction for all three element types, which is nice because, again, just like the Reef of Refraction Gladiator, we are doing damage of all three elements. I think that's it. I will chuck in like a Maven invitation and an Uber boss fight on the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you'd like to see more content like this, subscribe. Might not be any more till last league if I decide not to do another character, or until next league if I decide not to do another character this league. But I appreciate you guys watching. Ask questions and comments or whatever if you want, and I'll try to get to them. Stay safe out there. See you later.
Entertain me. Another jam. Under this. Oh, worth the effort.
Save the future. The past must be sacrificed.